Now we are going to start building our understanding of the different types of macro policy, including monetary policy, fiscal policy, and supply side policies. Now, these monetary and fiscal policies in turn collectively are known as demand side policies. So there is a bit of jargon going around when we talk about macroeconomic policy making, and these terminologies can sort of sound a bit overwhelming. But really, this topic of macroeconomic policy, it's really simple and interesting to understand. All you need to be careful about is to realize that we have learned to theoretically depict the macroeconomy through this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And therefore, in order to make sense of all of these different policies and the way the government tries to manage the macroeconomy through these policies, we just need to stick closely to this framework of ADAS and build our understanding of macro policy around that model of AD and AS, and that will allow us to keep things nice, easy, and organized. So in this first video, our target is to understand these demand side policies and to understand what is this monetary and fiscal policy, how it operates, and what are some of the practical issues and problems that policymakers face when they try to implement these policies in reality. Now let me first of all set things up by sketching out this AD-AS equilibrium over here, and let me make some assumptions, and from there we will extend the analysis to cover all these details of monetary and fiscal policy by the end of this video. So let's assume that there is an economy that initially starts in this equilibrium where the GDP Y star that this economy produces, let's assume that that happens to be exactly equal to the YP, or the potential output of this particular country. And let us also make a straight vertical red line passing through this potential output, and you can think of it as the monetarist long run aggregate supply curve, or you can just think of it as a reference line that is there to remind us that it is at this point on the x-axis that this country's potential output lies. Now this is the ideal short run equilibrium for an economy when it is producing at its potential, because producing at potential output means that you would be using all of your country's resources and therefore there would be full employment. However, we have learned that countries, they don't usually, in the short run, they don't usually are always at their equilibrium, such as this point E1 over here. They are not usually at their potential, I should say. Instead, in the short run, as we have learned earlier, economy's equilibrium, it fluctuates around its potential GDP. That is, we said that in the short run, most of the economies, they experience, or I should say almost all the economies, they experience short run business cycles, which means that countries' aggregate demand in the short run, it's volatile and it keeps on changing. Sometimes it increases, sometimes it decreases. And that fluctuation of aggregate demand is what throws the economy sometimes below its potential and sometimes above its potential in these short-run business cycles. Now, for starting from this initial equilibrium E1, we can depict these business cycles in this model over here. So we will first of all assume that, let's say, the aggregate demand falls and shifts left to AD2. Now that would take the economy to this equilibrium E2, where we are saying that the economy will fall below its potential output, which is undesirable because this is exactly what a recession is. You start producing lesser GDP than your potential, which means that your country's resources, some of them, they won't be utilized, and therefore we say that there would be unemployment when economy slows down and falls below its potential output. On the other hand, again starting from this equilibrium E1, if the aggregate demand increases to, let's say, AD3, then the economy will move to this equilibrium E3, where the economy, we say, will overheat, in the sense that it will start producing GDP which is even more than its potential, which is again not a good thing, because when economy overheats and moves beyond its potential, then you see, as compared to this equilibrium E1, at this equilibrium E3, the price levels increase and you start suffering from inflation. So the point is that economies, they will always fluctuate around their potential output, but both these fluctuations, whether you are below your potential or above your potential, they are undesirable. Being below your potential is undesirable because that is accompanied by excessive unemployment, whereas being above your potential is undesirable because that is accompanied by excessive inflation in the economy. And therefore, the central bank and the country's government, who are supposed to look after the country's macroeconomy, they try to jump in and they try to control the country's aggregate demand in order to manage and get rid of these business cycles. That is, starting from equilibrium E1, if the aggregate demand falls, where we say the country experiences a negative demand side shock, the aggregate demand falls and the country moves into this recession, falls below potential. Here the central bank and the government, trying to look after this macroeconomy, will come in and they will try to push and increase the aggregate demand to take the economy back to E1, back to its potential output, and get it out of this period of unemployment. Whereas starting from E1, if the aggregate demand increases and the problem your country faces is inflation, then the central bank, the government, will jump in, and this time they will try to push the aggregate demand to the left. They'll try to take measures that lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, and if that happens, aggregate demand shifts to the left, the economy will come back to its potential, the price levels will also come down, and the economy will cool down. And therefore, we give the name of demand side policies to all the efforts of the central bank and the government to control and manage the country's aggregate demand in order to manage these business cycles, these fluctuations around the country's potential output. Now, there are certain tools with which the central bank can try and control this aggregate demand, and then there are certain tools in the hands of the government with which the government can independently and separately also try to control the country's aggregate demand. Now, the tools in the hand of the central bank with which it can control the country's aggregate demand are money supply, interest rate, and exchange rate, whereas the tools in the hands of the government with which the government can control the country's aggregate demand are income tax and government spending. And when the central bank uses these three tools to manage the country's aggregate demand, then this is known as the monetary policy, and it is controlled by the central bank. Whereas if these two tools are used to manage and control the country's aggregate demand, then that constitutes fiscal policy, and this fiscal policy and these tools of fiscal policy, they are controlled by the government. So both fiscal and monetary policy, remember, they are known as demand side policies because they both try to manage and control the country's aggregate demand. The difference, the monetary policy, it's controlled by the central bank, and these are the three tools that monetary policy tries to use in order to control aggregate demand, whereas fiscal policy, again, it's an attempt to manage country's aggregate demand, but this fiscal policy is controlled by the government, and the two tools with which the government controls the aggregate demand are income tax and government spending. So those are the first few basics of what monetary and fiscal policy is and why do we call them demand side or demand management policies. Now, as far as actually implementing these monetary fiscal policy and actually using these tools to get the economy out of these deflationary and inflationary gaps is concerned, you see, when your economy is in an equilibrium such as E2 and it is below its potential and suffering from unemployment, then both monetary and fiscal policy, what they're supposed to do is to sort of ensure that the aggregate demand increases and shifts to the right. So as far as monetary policy is concerned, these three tools are concerned, if you want to change these variables in order to cause an increase in aggregate demand, then remember, you will have to increase the money supply, you will have to lower the interest rate, that would help increase the investment component of your aggregate demand, and you will have to depreciate your country's exchange rate, and that will give a boost to the net export component of your aggregate demand. Now, we have already learned in detail how each of these variables can shift your aggregate demand either to the right or left. So if you need to refresh those ideas, you can revisit that particular video on shifts of aggregate demand. But here, the point is, assuming you know why decrease in interest rate and decrease in exchange rate, I'm assuming you know how it works to increase the aggregate demand. But here, the point that we want to focus upon is that you see, when you are implementing monetary policy and changing the tools of monetary policy in a way that causes or leads to an increase in aggregate demand and a shift right of aggregate demand, then that is known as expansionary monetary policy. Because eventually, once you do this to your monetary policy tools, and if your aggregate demand does increase and shift to the right, then you can see as your aggregate demand shifts to the right, the economy's GDP will increase, and therefore we say the economy is expanding, hence the name expansionary monetary policy. Similarly, if you are trying to get the economy out of a recessionary gap using your fiscal policy and the tools of fiscal policy, again, the target is that you want to increase aggregate demand. If you want to achieve that through playing around with income tax and government spending, then you will have to lower the income tax, because that would increase the disposable income of households and therefore consumption will increase, or the government can simply start spending more, since government spending is directly part of your aggregate demand. So changing these fiscal policy tools in this particular direction again would mean that the country's aggregate demand would increase, and therefore the country's economy will expand, the GDP will start increasing, the employment will start increasing. So this would constitute expansionary fiscal policy when you lower the income tax and increase the government spending. On the other hand, if starting from E1, your economy experiences an increase in aggregate demand and enters this inflationary gap, then this time through monetary policy you would want to decrease the aggregate demand, shift it to the left. Now to do that, you will have to this time reduce the money supply. As far as monetary policy is concerned, you will have to increase the interest rate, and you will also have to appreciate your exchange rate. All of these things would mean that aggregate demand would shift to the left. It will allow you to take the economy back to potential, lower the price levels. But if you look at the y-axis, as you move from equilibrium E3 to E1, due to this shift left of your country's aggregate demand, your GDP will start shrinking. The economy will start contracting. So you are cooling off the economy. You are contracting it, but then on the y-axis you are coming down, and therefore you are controlling the price levels. Anyway, since due to shift left of aggregate demand, due to this particular change in the tools of monetary policy, since aggregate demand comes left and GDP falls and contracts, therefore whenever you change the tools of monetary policy in this particular direction to achieve a shift left of the country's aggregate demand, then that constitutes contractionary fiscal policy. So CONT for contractionary, meaning you are trying to contract your economy, slow it down, lower your GDP and cool it off. Similarly, given this inflationary gap, this equilibrium E3, you can also try to decrease the country's aggregate demand by using the tools of fiscal policy. But to decrease the aggregate demand, you will have to increase the income tax rate, and you will have to lower the amount of government spending, and therefore if you change the fiscal policy tools in this particular direction, then this eventually leads to a shift left of aggregate demand, and therefore this is known as contractionary fiscal policy. So those are the basics of monetary fiscal policy, and this is really how monetary and fiscal policy it actually works in reality as well. It's sort of like a video game. The central bank and the government, they are trying to control this aggregate demand, keep it as close to potential as possible. And the sort of remote control that the central bank has in its hand to control this aggregate demand, that remote control has 3 buttons. One controls money supply, the other interest rate, the other exchange rate. So the central bank is just observing that, okay, if you are below potential, we need to increase aggregate demand and take the economy back. If you have above potential, the central bank, using these tools, this remote control, they try to shift the aggregate demand to the left, decrease it, and restore the economy back to its potential. And similarly, the remote control of fiscal policy, it has 2 buttons. one controlling the income tax rate, the other controlling the government spending. And playing around with these instruments, changing them, increasing, decreasing them, the government also tries to either increase or decrease the aggregate demand depending upon whether you are above or below potential. And therefore, both these demand side policies, ultimately they are managing the country's demand, aggregate demand, in order to keep the economy out of these business cycle short-run fluctuations around the country's potential output. That is the purpose of your monetary fiscal policy, and that is exactly how it works in reality. Now, obviously, there are some practical problems that monetary and fiscal policy makers come across and they face, which does not mean that monetary fiscal policies are useless. They are, as I said, very effective. They are being commonly used by most of the central banks and the government. But there are practical issues. There are practical problems.